Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our town hall on DEI, part of a series of town halls we've been having to inform the community about changes going on in our lives due to government changes. And I'm delighted to say tonight we have Tammy Hodo, Dr. Tammy Hodo, who's actually a member of our foundation board. And she is a nationally recognized expert in workforce strategy, compliance and leadership development. And she, in fact, has worked with us for a couple of years, developing a racial healing and reconciliation conference. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sadia Barge, the coordinator of the Center for Advocacy and Social Justice internship program, and she will make the introduction.
Thank you so much, Dennis, and welcome everyone. Tonight, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Tammy Hodo. As Dennis mentioned, she is a nationally recognized expert in workplace strategy, compliance, and leadership development. With over 20 years of experience, she has worked with corporations, government agencies, law firms, and educational institutions to enhance organizational effectiveness, mitigate compliance risks, and improve workplace culture. As the lead consultant at All Things Diverse, Dr. Hodo specialized in helping organizations navigate complex workforce challenges by developing policies, training leaders, and implementing strategic workforce solutions. Her expertise in bias awareness, employee engagement, and professional accountability equips clients with the practical tools needed for sustainable success. Dr. Hodo is also a TEDx speaker, published researcher, and keynote speaker, delivering insightful and engaging talks on topics such as workplace leadership, professional integrity, and the evolving workplace landscape. Again, welcome, Dr. Tammy Hodo.
Thank you so much. Such a nice introduction. Look, I'm over here smiling because I'm excited for her. We were talking before the chat, so thank you. So are we just rolling? Am I just talking? Oh, Dennis, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yes.
That's okay.
Please begin. We're looking forward to hearing your remarks and
Okay.
look forward to the discussion.
Okay. So tonight we're going to talk about why the denial of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I will tell you that I do like to use the actual words because I think DEI has been so polarized and it's been so convoluted that it's essential basically for us to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging. Reality is we do not live in a monolithic society. America is a melting pot. We are all actually immigrants, some of us forced, others came voluntarily, unless you are indigenous. And so I'm struggling as a multi ethnic person who did a TED talk about the social implications of race, which is a social construct, with the pushback about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'd just like to share a little insight for people. If you did not know, the biggest benefactors of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, as well as affirmative action, are European American women. So it has not been people of color. But when people hear diversity, equity, and inclusion, what I have found as we've worked with different cities, at the federal government, schools, and organizations, is that a lot of people think it's surrounding that social construct of race, which it's not. I also want to note that African American women are the most educated demographic in America. And in the last 8 months, 350,000 have lost their jobs. And so we have some systemic issues in America. Reality is that we were a nation basically founded on colonization, right? America was colonized. Our indigenous brothers and sisters were given smallpox. We know, we're in Jacksonville, named after Andrew Jackson, who led the Trail of Tears when they figured they could not um, basically commit genocide against all the indigenous people. They placed them into boarding schools where they wanted them to assimilate. And so they stripped them of their culture, custom, and language. We know that we're also a nation that took people who were farmers, lawyers, business owners from the west coast of the continent of Africa, brought them over here and enslaved them. Our history in America, though, for those in the African diaspora, does not begin with slavery in regards to the history of us. But I think the pushback, why there's so much current pushback, and I'm just going to be very transparent on diversity, equity, and inclusion, is I think that European Americans were not prepared for minority excellence. In sociology, we do talk about this and we call it white lash. And you will notice that I don't use the terms white or black because those are social constructs and those are colors. So I talk about ethnicity. So, like myself, my mom is German, English, and Welsh. My father obviously was African American, hence the nice melanated color. But when I do have this conversation, you will hear me use those terms like that. So I think that we have a small but loud subset group of European American males that are very much concerned with the changing demographics, the power shifting. And so they are doing everything they can to push us back. I see the pushback to me is very concerning because it shifts focus away from the core principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is really about creating fair, respectful, and high performing societies as well as workplaces. And it reframes it as something diverse or, as I'm sorry, something divisive or optional. While healthy debate can refine approaches, much of the current resistance is rooted in political narratives rather than a nuanced understanding of the benefits that diversity, equity, and inclusion bring to our society, as well as organizational effectiveness, talent, retention, and innovation. So, from a practical standpoint, the current climate surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion, as a practitioner, we've had to adapt. We're emphasizing more neutral or outcome focused language like workplace culture, leadership effectiveness, and talent optimization to keep us those essential concepts alive without triggering political resistance. So, in no way am I changing the concepts or the work that I do. I'm just having to reframe it. So, we've had to rebrand, because if you say diversity or anything about equity, which I think it's important people understand that equity and equality are very different concepts. Equality is the assumption that we're all starting at the same point, so you provide us the same tools, and ideally we should all be successful. Where equity is recognizing that we have had boarding schools for our indigenous populations, that we've had redlining and housing covenants, which have prevented Jewish people and African Americans from being able to purchase homes even when they served in World War II, and it was a benefit that they earned that was not given to them. So I think it's really important that we recognize, this pushback is very much political. It's been framed as a partisan rather than as a universal workplace performance and fairness issue. We're a global society. And so I don't know how they anticipate us working with others if we're not culturally competent to do so. Because I know, like with Mr. Stone on the call, I know he does. I know him personally. I know he doesn't want to say anything to offend anybody, it not intentionally. But if we don't know better, it's same with me. I don't want to say anything to someone from a different culture and offend them, but if I don't know better, I can't do better. And that's part of the education about diversity, equity, and inclusion. The misinformation and the oversimplification of it is very problematic too, because we hear sound bites of virtual posts which distort diversity, equity, and inclusion as punitive or exclusionary rather than growth oriented. And I again want to emphasize, I think that's part of the problem. I think there are a small segment of European American males who are rather fragile right about now, and they're afraid that they're being pushed out of power, prestige, and economically. And that's problematic because while we are a global and diverse society, the reality is that European American males still hold the bulk of the power, the prestige and the money. I think there's a fear of change in regards to addressing the inequalities. And I think it makes some people uncomfortable, particularly for individuals or systems that benefit from the status quo. And so I again want to just reemphasize African American women are the number one most educated, college educated in America. But when we look at Fortune 500 companies, I think now we have 54 women in charge of Fortune 500 companies, and 2 of them are women of color. And so I think that says a lot about what is taking place and the fragility that we're seeing. I think we have some implementation missteps. I think that when with the murder of George Floyd, I really thought we were at that pivotal moment. And as Mr. Stone indicated, we had already been doing some racial healing and reconciliation conferences, trying to get everybody on board to understand that like we have more power and more commonality than we do differences when we come together as a group, of just citizens, right? It should not be based on that social construct of race or religion or sexual orientation or any of those things. Um, but I think that we have, when with the murder of George Floyd, and we thought we were going to have this racial reconciliation and this time, of racial healing. What happened was we got people who started doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work who were truly not competent to do that. And so they're going into the workspace, or they're going into different spaces, and they're hanging up their shingle. And when people are coming in these spaces, they're making them feel guilty for things that they did not do, right? So, I mean, I can't hold anybody currently who's alive accountable for slavery, but can I say that people have benefited from it? Yes, systemically, right? So I think that we've had the implementation misstep. Like I said, we've had people out in the field who were not really trained up the way that they should be, or were not subject matter experts. They went into these spaces and they made people feel guilt or shame. At All Things Diverse, one of our core components is our training is never about guilt or shame. It's about education and empathy, because you can't do better until you know better. And that's like when we do polls and we ask participants in our groups, how many of you have ever heard of boarding schools for our indigenous population, which, by the way, went until the 1970s. 8 out of 10 people have never even heard of that. When I ask people, how many of you have heard of redlining or housing covenants? 9 out of 10 people had never heard about that. When had you heard about the first racialized immigration policy, the Chinese Exclusionary Act? Most people had never heard of that either. So again, it's not about shame or guilt, it's about education and empathy. And so I will say that's one thing I'm proud of. I have never had anyone come back and say, "Oh my gosh, you made me feel so bad, when I took this training," because that's not the point. That's not going to move the needle, right? And in order to move the needle forward, then we need to ensure that we're actually doing the training, and we're doing it and designing it in a way where it's not confrontational, but just sharing what I found is the policy. Showing the American, policies, the laws that allowed these things to happen. And as we know, everything that's been legal is not morally correct, you know. And so we've seen that. So the implementation missteps, the poorly designed diversity, equity, inclusion programs that focused on one-off training or shame-based messaging, that eroded trust in the field that I work in. Economic stress, when budgets tighten, we know anything perceived as non-essential is scrutinized, even if evidence shows that diversity, equity, and inclusion positively affects retention and performance. And I think with the economic stress, we can also even think about our immigrants here. As someone brown, but someone born in America, I feel concerned about my other, people who are ethnic, specifically Hispanic, just going to work and having ICE roll up. You're hardworking. I thought it was the criminals, but these people are actively working to provide for their families, and they're being taken away. And I'm concerned that there's a lack of due process. And that's something we do talk about in diversity, equity, and inclusion, because we see when the economy gets tight, whoever the newest immigrants are often perceived, or viewed as, unwelcome. And that's how we got the Chinese Exclusionary Act. We asked the Chinese to come over because they had already built railroads to help us with westward expansion. And they did. They helped us build these railroads. And then as soon as the economy got tight, then all of a sudden there was this conversation surrounding, oh, they got opioid dens and they're doing this. It was like a criminality, right, of the people that we had asked to come and assist us. So another question that's been asked is, how would an absence of diversity, equity, and inclusion learning or acceptance impact our future generation? So I don't know how many of you all have seen, but I saw something today that's very concerning to me that says Prager University apparently is going to be one of the organizations that's going to be providing historical lessons. And the lesson I saw regarding slavery and this ideal that it was helpful for those in the African diaspora in teaching them a trade is very problematic. That is not at all what slavery did. And again, like I said, people who were taken were architects, they were engineers, they were mathematicians, they were agriculturists, business people taken off the west coast of Africa and brought over here and enslaved. And so to say that, I find that very disheartening. And I also struggle as someone, again, with the half European side, being German, English, and Welsh, knowing that our governor is Italian, and Italians on the hierarchy of European Americans are not very high up. Italian, Polish, and Irish, when they initially came to America, were perceived as less than, and they were treated in a very discriminatory way. And so when I see what he's doing, I'm just concerned, does he not want to recognize his past, or is it just the proximity to whiteness that he's eager to get to? So without the structural learning around equity, inclusion, and cultural competency, some of the workplace inequalities we're going to see are going to persist, right? So we're going to continue to see women not getting promoted for positions they're more than qualified for. Or we're going to see women not being afforded opportunities in the workplace. We're going to see people who have ethnic sounding names not even getting interviews, because that's an easy way to be discriminatory. I don't even have to interview you. I can look based off your name and may think that I know what ethnicity you are and just go ahead and 86, which is just throw away your application. And I was very intentional. Mr. Stone and I have children with a very similar name, but it's a biblical name. And so you would never know with my son what ethnicity he was. And I was very intentional about that because as an urban sociologist, I recognize that that is something that takes place all the time. So we want to make sure, that the workplace inequalities, when they persist, the reality is the systemic gaps in pay, right? So we know European American women make about 87 cents on the dollar compared to European American males. When we add melanin in, which is color, into that, we see women of color making even less, with our Latino sisters making the least, right? So we'll see systemic gaps in pay, promotion, and representation, which is going to widen. The cultural competency will decline. Future leaders may struggle to lead diverse teams effectively, which is going to harm collaboration and innovation. We're going to have an erosion of trust. Organizations may experience higher turnover and disengagement as employees feel unseen or undervalued. I think that this younger generation, is definitely about that life in that regard. Like, they won't stay somewhere that they do not feel welcome. If they feel that they're being isolated or tokenized, or they're not being engaged and valued, I think they're pretty quick to jump ship. And I commend them for that. I don't think that's a bad thing at all. Economic competitiveness for us in the US it's going to cost us as a nation. I don't know how many have read Heather McGhee's book, The Sum of Us, where she looks at what racism costs America each year. And it's a significant amount, and it's going to make us less competitive if we want to be in this global society as a true competitor. So research consistently shows that diverse, inclusive teams outperform homogenous ones in decision making and creativity because without diversity, equity, and inclusion, we lose this advantage. So I want you to think about some of the commercials you've seen where you've just been like, I know there could not have been any diversity at that table. And if there was diversity, there was definitely no inclusion, because we just had one recently about jeans, and I forgot the name of the model who did the ad for American Eagle, but
Miss Sweeney.
what was her name? I'm sorry.
Sydney Sweeney.
Yes, Sweeney. She did the ad, and they were doing a play off of words regarding genes, and that is eugenics was all about genes, right? And only having people who they perceive to be not feeble-minded, morally, good, a particular type of person. And when they did that ad, they caught a lot of backlash. So while they may have had diversity at the table, people who look like myself or other cultural competent people, they obviously didn't have inclusion because that person didn't say anything. And that's what inclusion is when your voice matters in that space. So that economic competitiveness we're going to suffer, research consistently shows that. Social polarization could deepen, without exposure to respectful, informed dialogue about differences, misunderstanding, and bias can harden into hostility. And I think we see that in our society now. We see people feeling very free with what they say, and there are consequences to what they say. I just saw on the news a gentleman was removed from a Breeze airline after he was making some very derogatory comments to the stewardess and other people, some racial epithets. And yeah, and he was removed off the plane by somebody who I guess used to be a linebacker. So whoever the gentleman was in that seat, he came and just picked him. I mean, picked him right on up and placed him back in his seat. But the plane got diverted. So we're seeing people who are rather bold and doing the things that they're doing. So who's being affected by the pull of diversity, equity, and inclusion? The rollback efforts impact multiple stakeholders. Employees from underrepresented groups, like I shared with you, over 350,000 African American women have already lost jobs within the last 8 months. Not to say they were in the diversity, equity, and inclusion field, but they have that now. It's not such a big issue that you don't have to represent. Ideally, your team doesn't have to be reflective of the community you serve, which is something we do believe in: diversity, equity, and inclusion. So employees from underrepresented groups may face reduced opportunities for advancement, mentorship, and the sense of belonging. Leaders and managers without diversity, equity, inclusion tools are going to lack strategies to resolve conflict, retain talent, and lead across differences because they're not going to understand how to do that. Organizations risk losing competitive advantages, face reputational harm, right? Like American Eagle just faced that backlash, and see increasing turnover costs. We're going to see communication at large miss out on the social and economic benefits of inclusion, equitable participation in the workforce. We're going to see customers and clients may disengage from brands, right? That seem to be out of touch with the social expectations. And I think we have seen that when we think about, you know, um, Ben and Jerry has been supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we see their brand just keeps going up and up. Target has rolled theirs back, and we've seen boycotts of Target, and we've seen how much financially that has impacted them, as well as other organizations. So I think all of these are some of the issues, and I'd just like to talk to you briefly about some of the misconceptions of the implementations of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Many of the misinformation or misunderstanding is from either misinformation, I'm sorry, or incomplete program design. So diversity, equity, and inclusion is not only about race or gender. In reality, diversity, equity, and inclusion covers multiple dimensions of diversity, including age, disability, social economic background, veteran status, and neurodiversity, right? So I'm a service connected disabled vet. So I'm a disabled person. If you were to physically see me walking, you may not know that, but every disability you cannot see, right? We know our older generation and even our younger generation often faces age discrimination. With our older generation, we hear things like, well, they're not going to understand, or they don't know how to do this technology, which I will tell you, the trainers that I have that are older, that's not the case. My older trainers tend to be very hyper focused when they're doing the training, which is a good thing. But I've also seen it on the other end of the spectrum with my younger trainers where people will question their knowledge or their capabilities. And believe me, they would not be in the roles that they are if it were not for their skill set, right? Another thing I hear is DEI, or diversity, equity, inclusion, is anti one group. Um, when done correctly, diversity, equity, and inclusion benefits everyone by improving society, the workplace culture, fairness, and performance standards. We hear, training alone fixes biases. That's not true. That one off workshop without systemic change like policies, accountability, matrix, rarely lead to lasting results. So you need to have the matrix, right? The SMART, right? The specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time bound goals when you look at diversity, equity, and inclusion. Another misconception, it's just an HR program. That's not true. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a business strategy that impacts innovation, market reach, as well as risk management. Another is it's a cost center, not a value driver. That's not true. Data shows that company with diverse leadership, their teams tend to outperform their peers financially and have better employee retention. Others misconception, the last one, is change can be achieved quickly. Sustainable inclusion takes sustained leadership, commitment, not just quarterly campaigns, right? So how can leaders, if you're a leader, how can you navigate this diversity, equity, and inclusion pushback? In these politically charged climates, leaders must shift from defensive to strategic engagement. So reframe the conversation. Use language around workplace excellence. That's what we're doing, right? Talent retention, compliance, innovation, instead of the polarized terms. That's like, though, with me, I struggle when people say, that woke ideology. I would want to be woke because that means conscious and aware. So to me, that's kind of like an oxymoron. I'm anti woke. It's like, why? Well, why would you want to be? Don't you want to be conscious, aware, and know exactly what's going on? Lead with data, not ideology. So you have to show them a return in investment in businesses in terms of productivity, market share, and reduced turnover. Like I said, like Ben and Jerry's, oh, they've been benefiting big time right now, and the organizations that have stuck with it and said that no, we're not going to take a knee, we're still going to implement these programs. They are doing far better than the other organizations that were too quick to roll it back. Tie diversity, equity, and inclusion to core business goals. Make it clear that diversity, equity, and inclusion is about operational strength. It's not a political alignment. And I think that to me is the biggest thing, is this whole ideal that it's political when it's not, or that people of one ethnicity are being passed over for unqualified people of another. That is not true. That is not the case. That's illegal. I mean, our company, we do Title VII and Title IX investigations, as we're MD 110 certified. And oftentimes that's what we hear, but that's not the case, because I can tell you, I know that that's illegal. Um, Create psychological safety, acknowledge, concerns openly, and provide space for questions without judgment. And that's what we always do when we do our training. We open it up, and I tell people, like, this is the safest space that you could possibly be in, because there's no judgment. If you have a question, there's no such thing as a stupid question. Ask me. If I don't know the answer, I'll straight up tell you I don't know the answer. But as a researcher, I can research it and get back to you. So people should be able to ask the question. I don't think that's because we need to provide that psychological safety. And without diversity, equity, and inclusion, those who are already on the margins of society are not going to feel psychologically safe in the workplace. They're going to disengage. They're going to, be at work looking for another job. So all these things are going to impact it. Also, show case studies, right? Share examples from peer organizations where diversity, equity, and inclusion improved outcomes without creating division. Focus on fairness and opportunities. Position equity efforts as upgrading systems so talent can thrive. Again, so everybody is at that table, has a voice, they're psychologically safe to share their opinion, and they know that when I share this, it's not going to be held against me. I'll tell you the number one claim that EEOCs and the number one that is settled is retaliation. So when cases like that happen and someone shares and they feel that they've been retaliated against, that's the actual number one EEO complaint. Focus on fairness and opportunity, right? So again, upgrading those systems. Model inclusive leadership. Leaders must show, not just tell, how equitable practices work day to day. I think that the workforce should mirror the community they serve. I work with a lot of cities, our company does, and that's one of the things we always tell them. You want your workforce to mirror the community that you're serving, you know? You want to make sure that your employees are trained so that they're not inadvertently saying something culturally inappropriate to someone who lives in the city. Schools, universities, and companies that are supporting disadvantaged groups despite diversity and equity and inclusion pushbacks, we see like these organizations, which I will have to say, Mr. Stone will be happy, the University of California system, even after affirmative action restrictions, what they did was they invested in target outreach. They used a holistic admissions and bridge program in order to sustain diversity. Arizona State University expanded their first generation college program, need based scholarships, and community partnerships without labeling them diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that way they were able to keep the focus on student success. Because remember, first generation college, that's a diverse group, right? They don't know how to navigate within this system that they've never engaged with or any of their family members. Microsoft has maintained inclusive hiring pipelines and accessibility initiatives by linking them directly to product innovation and customer satisfaction. So that's how Microsoft has done it. Ben and Jerry's, which I've mentioned, publicly committed to equity through supply chain choices. They're partnering with minority-owned businesses and they're advocating for policy change. Salesforce is another one. They've continued pay equity audits and leadership diversity programs. They're presenting them as competitiveness and target optimized strategies. And then the Cleveland Clinic invested in community health equity initiatives framed at redefining patient disparities and improving overall care quality. So these are some of the companies and some of the ways that they've been successfully able to continue with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And again, it's by reframing, how you speak about it, talking about psychological safety, civility in the workplace, inclusivity, things of that nature, and not making it as political as it's become. And making sure I would advocate for everyone to actually say diversity, equity, and inclusion. Not just, DEI, because that to me is the term that people seem to be very focused on. So with that, if there are any questions, I would love to take some.
First of all, I want to say, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
I had to step out. My Noah is celebrating a birthday today, so He was calling in from Boston, and we wanted to wish him happy birthday. But you know, I really like the way you laid things out, Dr. Hodo. And there's so many things to unpack
Mhm.
in what you said. So much work that has to be done. For instance, how do you deal with, there are people who feel threatened,
Mhm.
and have you thought through, which I'm sure you have, and I'm sure many experts have, some ways that we can overcome that fear and um, help people see that there's value in studying common ground, in learning from one another, learning about not common ground, what's
Mhm.
different about people. And um, I think, frankly, I think we were doing a pretty good job. I used to, saw a lot of films on or trainings on diversity, and the University of North Florida has them, had them every year. And I thought, for a corporate developed thing, I thought they were quite good. Not,
Mhm.
they just scratched the surface, of course, but they at least exposed people to the idea of difference and respect for where, people's culture and where they're coming from. So I'm
Mhm.
just curious, in all the study you've done and the work, you're in the trenches working on this. How do you see ways that we can help bring uh, people together on this topic?
I think we have to talk with people about the fear factor because there shouldn't be afraid. But I think that is something that's been instilled is that, hey, you're competing against people who aren't qualified and we have set asides for them. I think there's been a lot of rhetoric that is incorrect. It's not accurate,
Right.
it's not true. And that's what has created that fear. And so one of the scenarios we always give out in a breakout session when we do a bigger group is we give them a scenario of Jane and Steve. And Jane is telling Steve about this great opportunity. And Steve is a European American male. And he tells Jane, well, there's so much focus on diversity. There's no need for me to apply for this job. I would never be considered. And it's like he has already this self-defeated attitude. And the reality is if Steve is the best person, then that's who should get the position. But he doesn't know if he doesn't at least try, right? And a lot of training that we do, what I always tell people is we talk with we share experiences from I perspectives, because if not, what I get is my sister's cousin's husband's boyfriend's nephew had this experience. But when it comes to individuality, they can't share an individual experience that they've had where they've suffered, consequences like that. Or before you came on, we talked a little bit, we were talking about reverse racism, and I've heard that term a lot. Well, that's an emotional response, number one. Number two, it can't be reverse racism because in America, we won't even admit that there is racism. So, I mean, so you can't have both, right? So I think getting people to understand the value and the commonality that we have is one of the ways, because we have more in common than we do differences. One thing I would love to do if I were still a faculty member, I would have written and applied for a grant, and I would love for people to do 23andMe. I think that if people do 23andMe, I think that a lot of people will find that we do have more in common than they want to believe. Because I think a lot of people have some of the African diaspora in them, and a lot of the African diaspora has European America or European in them. And so just looking at it and recognizing that we're human beings. I think the best qualified person should get the position. I don't care if it's a man or a woman. I mean, we see women firefighters, we see women, I'm prior military in the military, we see women as police officers. I mean, it's all based on qualifications. If I could not have passed all the courses and all the physical, you know, things that I had to do, I wouldn't have been able to serve, period. It wouldn't have mattered if I was a man, a woman, if I were in the LGBTQI community. It wouldn't matter if I was Hindi or Christian. It wouldn't matter my social economic. None of that mattered. It was about me being able to do my job and get to that point. And then I would like to say, I wonder if the training you took from UNF was by Vector Solutions, because I write their training in regards to the one for the college level stuff on discrimination as well as implicit bias. So I'm the one who writes their courses, and it's used at hundreds of universities. And so
Yeah.
that's been good for me business wise,
Mhm.
because people will see who created the course. So.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, you have two things of value, of many things of value, but in this context, um, you are not afraid to tell the truth and to
Mhm.
let people know. And you have a method of delivery that um, makes it clear that you're just stating the facts across the board. You're not pulling back on something because it might hurt somebody's feelings, because of the value in what they're going to receive by learning more about this.
Mhm.
So I really admire the work that you do.
Thank you. Thank you.
I did have a question as well. It's kind of from a different perspective. I know you work with like leadership and like major organizations in that aspect, but looking from the like the lower level role, say for instance, those people that are working for those organizations or for those companies, like how would you suggest them like taking the chance to be able to stand up and say, okay, well, I matter, or like despite having the qualifications and things of that sort, recognizing their value and what they have to add, and like making them more providing them with more leadership capabilities to stand up in that regard.
So I think that they have to advocate for themselves. You know, I mean, you have to believe in yourself and you have to advocate for yourself, right? So, I mean, even in medical situations, we have to advocate. So, if you believe in yourself and you know you're qualified, you have to be willing to put yourself out there, and be willing to, say, okay, I'm qualified for this. These are the capabilities I bring to the table. I see, that this job is available and it's, a level above what I have, but this is what I'm interested in. I'm capable, I'm qualified, and just advocate. And I think that people need to do that. And I think you need to have a relationship with human resources. But I also think it's important that you understand policy, within any organization you work for. I tell people, like, if you know that personnel manual, you are good to go, right? Because you know how to work within the confines of that system. And so you have to know how to work within that system. But I think advocacy, but I also think sponsorship. So if you can get someone who's in a higher position, and you're, whether they're, mentor and sponsorship are different, right? So we have someone who will mentor you and teach you to get you to the next level, but a sponsor is going to bring your name up in spaces where you're not. So if they've seen your value and you've advocated for yourself and you've shown that, when something opens up, they'll be like, well, have we thought about, such and such, because I know that they would be a great addition to this team, and that they're ready and they're competent and they're able, because, John served as their mentor, and all he does is brag about them all the time. And so I think that's one of the issues, though, that women, like studies continuously show, women do not apply for positions that they're actually qualified for because they're hesitant, because they think they may not be qualified, where men will apply for positions they're not qualified for. You know what I'm saying? And so but it's a lot of the socialization process, right? Think about it. We got four major units of socialization: family, your peers, the K through 12, and the media. And if women are constantly told they're not qualified, they're not capable, this and that, you begin to internalize and believe that. and where men are constantly told, and even boys, right? Oh, you can do anything you put your mind to, this and that. Then they begin to internalize and believe that. And so I think being brought up like in my household, my parents were just like, we all could do anything we wanted. And I think it's important that we instill that in our children. I've instilled that in my son, who is Jonah. He's got Noah, I got Jonah. But I've been saying you can do anything you set your mind to, because we've set you up, and I know you're not only culturally competent, but academically, and you know how to navigate within a variety of spaces. So that's what I would say. I would say advocate for yourself. I would say get a mentor. I would be, looking for someone who'd be willing to sponsor me. And again, say my name in those spaces that I'm not in.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
can't underscore that enough. It was very helpful in my career. I had some both men and women who served as sponsors.
Mhm.
And frankly, I'm not I'm not the most brilliant person in the world, but I happened to bring at the time um, an interest in information technology that people just didn't have, and they knew it because they were so, had been in the field for so long. They were very far away from the digital world, but they knew that I had ideas that needed to develop, and I was very fortunate. Um, I want to ask you a question that's coming from an uneducated social services person.
Mhm.
I've done a lot of work in the field, but I don't have a good uh, structure. Uh, and I'm thinking of, so what happens and I'm going to give you my anecdotal view
Okay.
uh, uh, of this situation. But as we no longer require uh, communities, commercial communities, whatever they are, whether they're universities, corporations, nonprofits, whatever, as they're no longer required to look to have the workforce reflect the community. Um, and given one's the uh, the potential for one to prefer people more like themselves,
Mhm.
um, and even just forget out and out racism for
Mhm.
the moment, which very difficult to do. But I just am very concerned that it won't be too long before we're back to square one. And um, and unfortunately, what's happened, and it's almost like, boy, did we miss this. They flipped it over to
Mhm.
say, you're just this reverse discrimination idea. By trying to be more diverse, you guys are
Mhm.
discriminating against people. And so it's wrong. And we're going to not only so you can go back, think of all the statistics when they get those university statistics and they get them out there, the lawsuits are going to just fly. You
Mhm.
didn't let me into Harvard. You took somebody else. And so where do you see the tipping point? I watched a great program yesterday on the tipping point for climate. And we have about 5 years. And then the planet can't becomes actually an enemy.
Mhm.
Um, when does the tipping point come for this, and what's the likely scenario going to be?
Well, I think we may be at the tipping point. I mean, and I don't want to be political, but I have never seen so many mediocre European American men in charge of our government
Oh,
than I
that's
do.
for
I
sure.
mean, I'm
Yeah,
just being honest.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah, yeah.
you got a woman who's the Department of Education talking about she went to a A1 conference versus AI. I'm
Yeah.
prior military. You got the Secretary of Defense who's putting messages out on Slack and saying that they're not. I mean, we're at that point. But I guess my question is are we going to let hate, because that's what it is, consume us enough to allow
Mhm.
this to take place? So when you talked about like organizations not mirroring one another, that's that similarity bias, right? And we see it
Mhm.
even in the courts and stuff. Like studies have shown, if a judge can identify with the defendant, that could be my child or my grandchild, they tend to be a little more lenient. And if we have this, homogenous, workforce, they're not going to be very, and they're not going to be innovative. The performance is going to be stagnant. There's going to be a lot of blowback, just like the one we saw with the Gene commercial, things like that, where I think economically is where it's going to be the tipping point, where when we stop spending, So I've seen some people saying, well, they're building, European American communities in the hills of Arkansas or whatever. That's fine. But how about you don't take any inventions by women, any inventions by people of color while you build that community? I mean, you can't have both, and that's what people seem to want. They want to be able to have both, and say, well, we only, they're talking about white culture. First of all, white is a color. And I don't know what white culture is. I know what German
Mhm.
culture is. I know what Polish
Mhm.
culture is. I know, what I'm saying? I mean,
Mhm.
but that you could say maybe American culture, which is again that melting pot, right?
Mhm.
So, but I do think that we're at the point where it may take something really bad to happen,
Mhm.
but we're at that point where I think we're seeing we're going to see the ramifications. I
Mhm.
believe we'll see them soon, Dennis. I
Mhm.
think the revolution will be televised this time.
Yeah. 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 Definitely thoughts to ponder.
Yeah,
Uh,
and I mean, I just think about me, right? So my parents married 1962, which like was before Loving versus Virginia. It wasn't even
mhm.
okay to do that. But when you love someone, you love someone. I'm concerned the marriage equity equality is going to go before the Supreme Court in the fall. And
Mhm.
then next, I already know what's going to come next. If that gets overturned, then we're going to start talking about marriages interracial or
Right.
interethnic
Yeah.
marriages. You
Mhm.
know what I'm saying? You already know how that's gonna go.
Yeah.
And then like women not having the right to the autonomy of their own body, the African American woman in Georgia who was kept on life support, because
Mhm.
she was pregnant, she was a nurse. Let's talk about health disparities and health inequity. I mean, she was a nurse and she kept complaining and they kept just ignoring her. This is a
Mhm.
medical professional and she's telling them having these massive headaches and she ends up having an aneurysm. They find out she's pregnant. They kept her alive till she, until they no longer could. Her organs start to shut down and then she had her child. It's just like you're harvesting things. These are some unethical times that I
Mhm.
think we're seeing, and that's very concerning to me.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, we're right at 7:59, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but any final words to share on this topic for our audience?
I will say, all my European American allies, you're needed now. The time is now because I will tell you, as a woman of color, I know my voice is not resonating. It is not seen as valued. So all our European American, people who feel that if you're a true ally, I'm gonna need you to be about it, not just talk about
Mhm.
it. I'm gonna need you to show up and show out. And I do
Yeah.
see some of that taking place in Jacksonville. But I do see a lot of people who are silent. And that is so problematic to me because it's like when I speak, I'm preaching to the choir, you know. But when other people speak, like with you, Dennis, and you're out there and you're doing this work, that's what allyship is. It's an action verb. It's not, let me
Mhm.
just sit in
Right.
my house. And I just want to close with part of that poem, which I won't get right, but just remember when they came for the gypsies, I didn't say anything because I wasn't one. When they came for, the Polish, I didn't say anything because I wasn't one. When they came for the Jews, I didn't say anything because I wasn't one. And when they came for me, there was no one left to say anything. And I think that's what people need to think about, because as they're picking off certain groups, your group will be next.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hodo, for being with us this evening. And Sadia, I will let you close.
All right, thank you once again, Dr. Hodo, and thank you to our amazing audience for speaking with us. We will have this up on YouTube, so if you want to continue learning more and getting involved with various issues such as this one in DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion with the Jacksonville Urban League, please continue to stay connected and have a good night. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank
Thank you. Have a good night.
You all too. Thank you.
Thank you.